Alright, this screencast is going to pick up with slavery in the Chesapeake and in South Carolina, and we're going to kind of compare the different slave experiences between those two different regions. So, kind of as the slave trade is increasing in popularity, also because of the winding down of indentured servants, we do see more and more slaves being imported into specifically the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. Remember and recall that tobacco was a somewhat laborsome crop, and so there is a labor force that could be used to help the farmers and plantation owners harvest their tobacco plants and tobacco crops. But overall, tobacco is actually not that physically demanding compared to other goods or crops such as sugarcane and rice, as we'll talk about. So overall, the slaves living in the Chesapeake region and being sold to places in Virginia and Maryland are going to have less intense and less oppressive circumstances, less severe, I would say, than in other places of the New World. For example, like compared to the West Indies, where they're planting sugarcane, things are much more horrific for slaves in those regions. And also, tobacco eventually kind of suffers a crash, like in the market, and that means the farmers really, whenever you have a good that has been overproduced and there's a bit of an economic crash, you can't afford to overproduce or overmake your tobacco plant. You have to be sure to create and plant just enough that's in demand. And so you really can't overwork your slaves and force them to continue planting beyond those means, because that's not resourceful and that's wasteful on your money and resources. And so they're overall just treated a little less harshly because of that lack in demand. You also are going to start seeing, though, in this region of the Chesapeake, female slaves being bought and sold. Thus, they can have slave families in effort to kind of keep up their slave population. They'll have like in-house slaves being born. And so we're going to see that as well start to happen at this point. Now, in South Carolina, things are going to be a little more oppressive for the slaves living there. Recall that South Carolina is kind of where our wealthy settlers live. They can afford large amounts of slaves, and we'll see in some cases really terribly, but we'll see slaves worked to death because the mindset is, well, I can always just buy more. And, that's terrible. But it did exist at the time. The other aspect of the South having more oppressive conditions than in Virginia and Maryland is that the crop that they harvested in South Carolina was rice. And I'm not sure if any of you know about how rice is grown, but it kind of grows in the water. It's very muddy, kind of unsanitary conditions. And so it's just a really hard life for the slaves who were kind of forced to serve in the South Carolina region. Now, even though the planters and the farming population would try to keep their African Americans kind of oppressed, we do see community emerge from within the African culture. We start to see barriers being broken down by slaves, even though they kind of all come from different regions in Africa and off the West African coast. They'll kind of begin to form relationships with each other, and they very much have a bond between them. They will learn and eventually develop the language called Gullah, which is spelled Gullah. It's kind of a cross between English and African languages, and so they're kind of making connections with each other. They're able to communicate with each other, and especially in a language that the planters don't understand. And there's also strong family ties. They have strong, kind of tight-knit families, even though at any point a member of the family could be bought or sold, which is just really, really hard for someone to imagine that even though you're in this terrible life as it is, at any point you could be separated from someone in your family for a profit on someone else. And that's just not, it's just horrendous to think about. But they had their own, culture and religion. Some are going to kind of migrate to Christianity. Some kind of hold on to their Muslim beliefs that they had from back at home, or perhaps their African gods if they were polytheistic. So they are religious people, but there are still limits to them. They're not necessarily being educated at this point, and they're not really given many freedoms at all. Now, there are some cases of rebellion where the slaves do try to rise up and overthrow their masters and their owners. I'll be honest, it's not often recorded because they were afraid, and they knew that they probably couldn't, successfully have an uprising, and so in an effort to save their lives, they kind of, in many cases, accepted their present fate. But you do have kind of like silent forms of resistance where maybe they would like purposefully break some of their farming tools so that they couldn't do the work that day, kind of misbehave in that way, but kind of a hidden way. The more direct examples were rare, but one specific example is the Stono Rebellion. And essentially, it's going to take place in South Carolina. And what's going to happen is Spain is still in control of Florida. And the Spanish governor of Florida makes an announcement that he is going to offer freedom to any slave who makes it to Florida. They are freeing the slaves in Florida. We'll see actually Europe kind of embrace this mindset of abolishing slavery before parts of America do. So Spain is controlling Florida. They're freeing some slaves in Florida. And you're going to have slaves in South Carolina feel brave enough to attempt to make that trip south down to Florida. Really the only stands in your way is Georgia. But the only problem is it was a small group that were brave enough to do this, so they don't really have the numbers to successfully defend themselves. You had about 20 slaves meet at the Stono River, which is in South Carolina, which is why it's called the Stono Rebellion. And they met there, and they had stolen some of their guns from different plantations and different families. And their plan is to march to Florida and gather people along the way, kind of freeing slaves plantation to plantation. But unfortunately, while they were able to make a little bit of progress, they are not going to make it even into Georgia, and a white militia is going to put down the rebellion. And then from here, we're going to see even stricter rules being placed on these slaves to prevent rebellion in the future. So it really doesn't make matters better for anyone, unfortunately. So that's just one example of an uprising, the Stono Rebellion. We'll go over these last two notes in class tomorrow. It's really not a whole lot left. If you would just write down any questions you have, and I will see y'all in class tomorrow.